Her story.
So when does it start in?
Yeah, they're in now.
Yeah.
All those people. Very good.
Right.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here tonight. My name is Amy Weishart. I'm the director of the library. Really excited to welcome Elizabeth Garber in conversation with Christina Baker Kline to discuss Elizabeth's new memoir. Hot off the presses.
Hot off the press.
Yeah. We also have several people joining us on Zoom. We'll be recording tonight's talk. We'll have it available on our website after tonight. We're also selling copies of Elizabeth's book. Her publisher is selling them. They'll be available after the talk. And I'll be selling some copies of Christina's latest book right out here. So if you're interested, please stop by one of the tables. So I'll just quickly introduce them both and then turn it over to them. Elizabeth Garber, her memoir is Sailing at the Edge of the Water, a memoir of a young woman's daring year. It details her experiences as a teenager on board a once majestic yacht turned sailing school, along with her younger brother and 50 teenage misfits. So we hear a lot more about it tonight. The book chronicles a transformative year in the throes of late adolescence that leads to courage, grace, and a reclamation of selfhood. Elizabeth is the author of an earlier memoir called Implosion, Memoir of an Architect's Daughter, which was a 2018 finalist for the Indie Next Generation Book Award for Memoir. She's also the author of several poetry collections. So really excited to have her here, and she lives in Mid-Coast, Maine. Christina Baker Kline is the #1 New York Times bestselling author of 8 novels, including The Exiles, which we have for sale tonight, Orphan Train, and A Piece of the World. She lives in New York City and in Southwest Harbor. So we're thrilled to have you both here.
Thank you. What an honor to be doing this with you. I'm so delighted. So Elizabeth and I don't know each other. We met the first time tonight. And Maine is a warm community, a writing community, but somehow we've never crossed paths, and I had never read your work before. And I think you reached out to me, whatever it
Last
was.
winter.
Yeah, a long time ago. And I didn't know you, and I'm just being completely honest. I didn't know you, and I didn't know your work, and I was really busy, and I thought, oh, I just can't do it. But you were so lovely and persuasive, and eventually I got the book, and this is what it looked like that I read.
It's only hard copy.
Bound with the cover, but not actually glued together. So that was really a fun experience. And as I started to read it, I knew immediately that I was in the hands of a master. It's just beautifully written. I mean, interesting that you mentioned the poetry as well as the other memoir and these books that you've written that are in different genres, in different areas. Your writing is poetic, but always grounded in specific detail and in story. Mm-hmm. And so it was just a delight to read. And have any of you read it yet? I know it came out yesterday. But it is just so compelling. I think you'll love it. So I have a million questions that I'm very excited to be here with you. Here's how we're going to format it. Elizabeth is going to, well, first of all, we have a 3-minute video that you can talk about how that happened. And then I'm going to have her read us the first section, which is only maybe 2 minutes, and we'll talk about that. And then there are 2 other short readings that we discussed, I think, that will give you a flavor of the book.
Right.
So yeah, and then we'll open it up to questions. So that's how it's going to be.
So I thought, and this book is so visual, and part of creating the book is we needed a lot of photographs in the middle, but I thought when I go out and give book talks, or when there's this whole new thing of making book trailers. So I hired this filmmaker in Camden to put together take these photos and make a short book trailer. So it would, so when I give a talk, it drops people into the experience of what it's like being on a ship, what it's like climbing the rigging, and what it was like in the 70s with all these hippie kids on the ship. So I thought we can do our quick little video, and you're the first people to see it. There are two versions of it. One has Santana and Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, but it can't be, it's not copyrighted, so we can't have it on this. So you'll have the milder music version.
It's narrative. Cue the 60s and 70s. Right. Should you turn on?
Yeah.
Let's just turn on.
In 1971, the Oceanic School leased the Sea Cloud, a four-masted, square-rigged yacht built in the 1930s by the businesswoman Marjorie Merriweather Post to be their school at sea.
I chose to go. I sent myself to Oceanics. My parents were like, if you're going to finish high school, then yeah, please go.
She didn't even tell me anything. She just sent me off, and I arrived at Antarna and I said, this doesn't look like it's going anywhere right away.
There were 50 mostly American teens, students kicked out of the best boarding schools, Native American brothers, and naive Midwesterners who'd never seen the ocean, who were all sent to a neglected yet once magnificent sailing yacht to learn to sail.
I think when we first got there, the ship was sitting on the bottom. I mean, I think the tide went up and down. I don't think the ship went with it.
I got out of a taxi with my duffel bag and looked at this and I thought, my God, I've come to heaven. On first glimpse, you think, she's a little rough, but with a little elbow grease, we can get it going.
You know what I thought? I thought, what the hell did I get myself into?
The students, teachers, and crew worked for 3 months to restore the ship. They spliced rope, scrubbed the decks, worked in the engine room and in water tanks, and climbed the rigging. When the school finally set sail, the students lashed 16 of the 30 sails to the rigging. But instead of clear sailing, their troubles were just beginning.
There was a payphone, and I would call home once a week, and my mother had no interest in hearing about the ship, but my dad wanted to hear all the details, and I kept thinking he would be shocked and upset about the terrible things that we had to do on the ship, and they didn't seem to be fazed by how dangerous it was.
No one knew that it was impossible. That's the only way it happened.
We were all collected into the ship. The ship wasn't going to float unless we worked it. Let's work it. Let's make it live.
For me, that was a momentous time. We were ready to take on the world. This is normal. This was normal. And that was part of what the late 60s and the 70s were about.
Great, yeah. When you read the book, those people are all in a sort of, you've got a section of photographs, yeah, so you can really go and figure out who's who. That's great, thanks. So, Elizabeth, why don't you read that very beginning part, and we'll start with that.
In the rigging. I can't. My legs wobble on the rope rung, digging into my sneakers. I hold on to cables running up along the mast over 100 feet above the ship's deck. I close my eyes for a second, but that makes everything worse. My chest thuds, my body trembles. I try to speak up. me, the pitiful teenager frozen in the rigging. I can't do this. I don't care how pathetic I sound. The crewman on the second platform above me leans over the edge and gives directions. Reach up one hand over your head to seize hold of these shrouds. Then the other hand, pull yourself up onto the platform. His voice is upbeat. You can do it. My hands are sweating. My knees threaten to give way, and he sounds so fucking positive. All the way up this rope ladder, I face the massive steel mast and chant, I can do it, like a little ridiculous little engine that could, and I'm okay until I get there. I'm on the main mast of our school's 4-masted square rigger for sail training. Everyone is required to climb up and over the second platform in the rigging. But I'm supposed to lean my whole body out at a 90-degree angle over wide open space. What if my arms let go? There's nothing under me, 100 feet below the deck, before the deck. The mast moves, a slow, sickening sway. I glance down at the docks, the boatyards, and the causeway to Miami when nausea catches in my throat. Dad's voice slams into me like a loudspeaker turned on in my brain. You're weak. You've never learned to work. My hands shake and my grip starts to slip. His voice tears into me, pummeling. His voice, a 1-2 punch until he knocks me with a hook. You'll never amount to anything. I tremble, barely holding on. I close my eyes and my head slumps against the rope rungs. Coming to the ship was my escape, but Dad knows exactly how to break me. I can't hold him at bay. My arms are weakening. I just can't do it.
So that is the very beginning of the book. Elizabeth, did you write that scene first, or did you actually write it in sort of in order as you were going?
I knew that there were scenes that, it took about 5 years and doing a lot of research and talking to my friends, and I had to gather up these fine friends that were shipmates from the school. And I pieced together what happened in what order, and I had old letters and I had photo albums and thought, okay, how am I going to do this? And then there were scenes that I thought, all right, I'll write that and I'll write this. And I put these pieces together. That actually was one of the last, you often have to write the introduction at the very end.
Yeah.
Because I had it starting with my brother and me on the ship when we were being held hostage in Panama by armed gunboats.
That's another story.
That's another story. But we were teenagers and we were joking about it, like, you know, when you're a teenager and you think you're immortal, you know, and you just go, all right, oh, he was going to throw my journal down. And we were joking about it. And I had a teacher who said a book has to start really at the edge. It can't start with that you're joking and this isn't really scary. Or actually, one of the kids from the ship who's now grown up and teaches celestial navigation, he said, what was disaster on this ship? What was dangerous? And I said, don't you remember when we almost hit the nuclear sub? Don't you remember when we had a hole in the hull? Don't you remember when the tow line exploded and could have decapitated people? He went, oh, at the time as a teenager, I didn't think anything was dangerous.
And he really didn't.
And he didn't, he really didn't, right.
Was it only when you started really writing it that you yourself registered how dangerous it was?
Yeah, I realized. And then when I had other people read it, because a lot of these stories we just thought were funny. And then I had an editor read through it going, oh my God, this is so inappropriate. This is so neglectful. She was like a parent going, how did any parent let you be on the ship? And the 70s were pretty much neglectful parenting anyway. And we were sent and people didn't, you know, you'd call home on a payphone once a week, barely. There were some people who never, there was one kid who was required to write his mother. He wrote her once from Panama before while we were being held hostage. But it was just, we were just there on our own and didn't have a lot of contact with family. And we really made family with each other on the ship.
Yeah. You know, they say that all child narrators are unreliable because they don't see the big picture. And one of the interesting things about this memoir is that you write from the perspective really of a teenager in the moment, and you're living it in her perspective. So as readers, we see the world through your eyes, but we also see a bigger world, and you and I were just talking about that in the other room. Your family was dysfunctional,
Quite
to put it mildly.
Right.
And your father was actually pretty abusive.
Yeah.
And as a narrator, you allow us to see that, but you're living as a teenager. So we have to sort of go farther with that,
Right.
go further with our own interpretation.
Right.
So talk a little bit about that, about the family you were in and how it led you to this ship.
So my father was a modern architect and of the era where we lived in a glass walled house that he had designed, and we spent years finishing and building
And where was this?
in Cincinnati, Ohio, outside of the city. And so when we started building this house and it started being his monument, we became workers for his monument. And his relationship with it was our childhood ended when I was about 12. My brothers were 9 and 7, and we became workers on the house, and we were lectured and given job lists, and it was childhood's end. And he actually, as the 60s ended and the 70s, or actually as the 60s really were cooking up, he was building a building on the University of Cincinnati campus. The challenge of our generation against his generation amplified, and he got more and more crazy.
In what way?
He would yell and yell and yell for hours and lecture us, and he demanded I end my relationship with my Black boyfriend, and there was also sexual abuse and violation, but he was just so critical. But he and I had such an idealized relationship when I was a child, and I would go to all his jobs, and we could talk about art and architecture. So there was a part of me that was always hoping we could get that down back. And he came to the ship.
And there were flashes.
There were flashes.
Yeah.
So you see him as kind of normal and kind of cool at the beginning. And he was cool. He drove a Jaguar XKE.
You lived in a glass house.
And lived in a glass house, and my mom worked. And he picked out all her clothes and her jewelry, and I had to know the designers of all the furniture in the house. It was just like we lived his life. And when we stopped being in service of him, we became the enemy in a way.
How old were you when you first really felt that happening?
About 12, 13, when I wanted to listen to the Beatles, and he thought it was ridiculous, and he only thought you should listen to jazz. So it was like it started slowly, and then it got worse and worse. So he decided that he had these 2 problem children. I was the problem child. He declared that I was too immature to go to college my senior year of high school. And there was no conversation, you could have no choice. And he decided my brother was the real problem one. My brother, 14-year-old brother, had been paddled 58 times in middle school.
By the teacher.
By the teacher.
Was it a parochial school?
No, it was a public school. So he decided, someone gave my dad this article from the New York Times about this school and a ship. And he called up the director, he talked about it. She was very charismatic. She was 24. No one knew she was that young or inexperienced for.
A little bit of the Elizabeth Holmes,
I know.
Thanatos vibe I was getting from this very charismatic and beautiful woman who
Decided to create this school.
decided to create a school with no experience and money that was sort of a shell game.
And then she decided to lease the ship. And the owners of the ship said it would just take 2 weeks to get it ready to sail. And when we got to the ship, there was no electricity, the engines didn't run, there was no water running, there was a hose to the galley, and it was a disaster. There were fires in the engine room. The bowsprit had been knocked off. It was a wreck.
There were
And then-
barnacles all over the base.
Right, and then a rigger came, and the rigging kept giving way because it had been sitting for 4 years in the tropical heat. And so the irony is my dad had this vision of he had always wanted to sail around the world. So he sent my brother and me and all these other parents. So there were 50 kids who were sent to the school, 46 boys, 7 girls. We were sent, the director decided to send all the girls off to get the pill. And we're told, just say that you're 18. We had no permission. It was just, she wanted to make sure we were okay.
I mean, one of the things you capture in this book so well is the transition from the 50s and early 60s into this whole different world. So your father's, the tension with his sort of letting you have more, listen to music, etc. But also the fact that he just let you go, and your mother as well, into this situation where you're one of 7 girls, all these boys with absolutely no supervision.
And the teachers had just graduated from college, and they were in their early 20s.
And doing drugs.
And they were doing drugs and hanging out, and they weren't really supervising. So we were really on our own, and the kids really, we had to become family and there for each other. My 2 closest friends in my life are from that ship, because we so bonded, and all these, it was a wild world. But as as my brother said, hell yeah, it's dangerous, but I don't want to leave. I don't want to go home. I won't survive if I go home.
Well,
even
that's
when we were held hostage, we didn't want to go home.
right.
Yeah.
Well, you do a beautiful job of capturing what it would mean to go home and what it did mean ultimately to go home, which is that, again, you would be under your father's thumb,
Right.
and not have any autonomy. And you were, even though it was crazy that you were on the brink of disaster in all these ways, you at least felt that you were in charge of your own destiny on the boat.
Absolutely.
So why don't we read another section?
Let's see. I'll read about when I walked on board and I met Kim, who would become my best friend. And the details give you the difference in our personalities right from the start. The taxi from the Miami airport drove slowly through a maze of metal shipping containers stacked 3 high. I clutched my sweaty cash and asked again, making sure I was in the right place. Ashbury Docks, the Antarna, yes. The driver pulled to a stop at an open dock, and there, through the windshield, I saw a rust-streaked hull and a line of portholes. When I stepped out, it towered over me, a 4-masted ship I'd only seen in a black and white photo from the 30s, with 30 sails filled with wind and the hull slicing through white caps. I gasped, holy shit. The ship was swarming with boys. Teenage, shirtless, long-haired boys lined the railing and milled around on dock, and a lot of them seemed to be looking at me, a skinny 17-year-old girl in a white linen jacket and short shorts with new sandals and freshly shaved legs. I blushed from all the attention. A couple of tall boys with ripped jeans ambled down the gangway of the ship and walked over to me. They were tanned and dirt-stained and grinning. "You're here for oceanics, right?" I could only nod. "Cool," they said before they hoisted my duffel and backpack from the trunk of the cab and carried them down the gangway and down the deck. I followed them, holding onto the railings until I realized how greasy they were, and I let go. But the slight sway of the ship, I grabbed on again. I made a mental note, don't wipe the grease on my good clothes. Midway, I paused and looked down at the narrow chasm of dark water between the dock and the hull. I shivered. This was the ocean. I was a Midwestern girl, and this was only the second time I'd seen it. So after I got up on deck, I looked down the long deck of the ship, and who I noticed most was a girl striding towards me who seized my attention. She was tan, a hardworking, ground in dirt farm tan, shorter than me, and she moved like a strong muscled animal as if propelled towards me. People slid out of her way. Her unbrushed hair was truly dirty blonde, held in place with a couple of barrettes, clearly not for looks, but for work. Was she gonna run me over? She stopped in time and squinted at me. "Hey, you're Elizabeth, the librarian. I met you when I came to New York for my interview. I'm Kim." Her voice was husky and strong, and everyone turned to listen when she announced, "I gotta take a shit." My mouth involuntarily pursed, a twinge of reaction I'd been unable to hide. My cheeks flushed with heat, which clearly amused her. She looked at me piercingly. "As soon as I get back, I'll show you the girls' quarters." Her feet pounded down the metal gangway to shore, making it clang and jolt. She called back to me, "Hey, we're roommates." Then she raced across the dock, leaping over tar-dripping buckets and tangled of discarded metal and rope until she disappeared into a concrete block building.
One of the pleasures of the book is your friendship with her, especially in the setting with all these men, all these boys. Were you ever afraid, or did you feel ever threatened?
I felt amazing. Here, there's a gangway and there are ropes and there are rats on the dock and whatever. And there's a teenage kid on rotating watches at the gangway. And that's our only protection from the world. And I felt completely safe until actually, even when we were being held hostage, until we got off the ship and actually were in Puerto Rico, when I was molested while sleeping in a field. But before, I always felt safe.
What do you think it was? I mean, the combination of kids were, a lot of them, like you, had been sent there as a sort of juvenile delinquent solution. So why was it, do you think? Was it the bonding that
There was
you
a
all?
bonding, and I think because I was naive, I just assumed I was safe. And the kids with each other were, and kids sometimes touch each other, but no one, I never heard of anyone coming on to someone inappropriately or, yeah, there was an amazing kind of trust, even though we were in this wild and crazy place. Yeah.
Yeah. So one of the things that fascinated me as I was reading it is how you managed to remember these granular details and these events that were so long ago.
Right.
And in fact, one of your journals burned. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit about how you piece this all back together. And also, I think it's really interesting that you used Kim's journal years later.
Years later, so there were a number of kids on the boat who wrote in journals, but I probably wrote, Kim and I were like the intense journal writers, and Kim had a stenographer's notebook and had all these color pens and wrote in big handwriting full of emotion. And I wrote very careful, beautiful handwriting. And I had this old, like a gentleman's red leather, big calendar, and it was thick. And I would write sometimes up to 8-10 pages a day. And I was so devoted to writing about the ship. Midway through, I realized, oh, it was more important to connect with people than write. But I was so into writing, but I feel like writing so distinctly every day about what was happening and the people and the interdynamic, I feel like that locked a lot into my memory. And I was raised to be sort of observing art and architecture, so I'm very visual, but then I was also a reader and a writer. So when I started going back, and I had made a photo album when I came home from the ship, and we had photographs. And then I had the parent letters from our charismatic 24-year-old director. These long parent letters about what was going on.
You mean letters to your parents?
To our parents, and letters from my brother writing home, my letters home. And then I searched out as many of the students from the ship, and I found 12 of the students, and I found 5 of the teachers, and I created a private Facebook page. So that
how long ago?
About 3 or 4 years ago. And I started asking questions, and we started piecing together, and I started making an outline of when did the bowsprit go on? When did we start? When did we do sail training? And so for the parent letters, I also had pieces. So I pieced the pieces together, but it was so vivid in my mind, and I could just write scenes and I remembered how people talked, like that scene of Kim's first line. I will never forget Kim's. I never heard anyone say that before in my life. So it's like these lines were just really vivid, and I have a really good memory for vivid details, especially about things that I've written about in journals. So and then putting pieces together. But on this Facebook page, I would ask a question, like I asked the question of, there was a book written about the sea cloud, and over there it has a little section about our time on the ship. And they had interviewed the captain of the ship years later when he was in his 80s. And he said that we had been shot at in Panama from one of the gunboats. And I wrote on this Facebook page, that never happened. And someone else said, oh no, I never heard of that. And someone else said, oh yeah, that's, someone made that up. And then one of the kids said, oh yeah, we were shot at. I was running the the anchor chain when we were trying to sort of move out of the way of being run into by a cargo ship. And the PT boat shot machine gun with its machine gun right over my head. I could hear it go right over her head. That was zip. And then Kim, my best friend, was up on the bridge with the captain. And she said, oh yeah, I saw it all. And my friend Pogo was in the bowsprit net. And he said, I was there. It was at early dawn. He said, I thought they were going to kill me. And they somehow never told anyone else. There were things that people kept a secret. So until I asked that question, I'd never heard it. And none of the rest of us had ever heard it. It was like, how did we not know that? But there were these stories that kept coming out, and these amazing stories of events that people had happened. So I added those into the story because they just added so much more aliveness and vibrancy, and it made it a treasure hunt. So it was like finding more stories of things that I didn't know then. And part of memoir is you have reflection of age. So 50 years later, reflection of looking back on it, seeing my naivete, seeing sort of the trust and untrustworthy adults, and how we were failed by adults over and over, and how the kids came to really rely on each other because we were the ones who could trust.
Yeah. What do you think is the most difficult aspect of writing this book for you? What was the hardest thing?
Actually writing about home and writing about my dad. And there was some really hard things that happened at the end. My brother and I both had considered suicide when we returned home. And writing about that was really hard. And that was some of the last pieces that I wrote. I had written them in my previous book, but I had to come to them newly. And then I realized that because we thought we'd lost all the strength that we had gotten on the ship. And then, but we pulled ourselves out and we were able to leave and break away from the pull of my dad's control over us. But we almost lost it on the way.
And there's been fallout.
Yeah.
For your brother and
Yeah.
I'm sure for you as well.
Yeah, we both went different ways. I did decades of therapy to get over my childhood, but I became an acupuncturist, and I'm sort of like a combination therapist acupuncturist. And because I went through such tough stuff, I have a really high tolerance for hearing other people who've gone through really challenging things. And I think it really deepened and added to my gifts as a practitioner.
Your earlier memoir was about your family,
Yes.
specifically. And then you've written books of poetry as well, of course. What was it that led you to this specific story?
I knew. So when I got home from the ship, I created this big photo album, and I knew that I had to write about the ship. And I found in a letter to my found in a later journal that I would talk to my grandmother about writing it. And she said, well, it seems really clear that the plot is really following the line of the journey of the ship. So by 1987, by 1978, I was already thinking about writing it. So I've known my whole life that I had to write this story at some point. And after I finished Implosion, and I'd written a chapter about this, then I went, when you're finishing a book, you need to have already starting another book so you don't go into postpartum depression after a book comes out. I learned that the hard way. So by the time I was finishing Implosion, I was already starting this and starting the research.
Oh,
How are
is
we
it
doing?
just after 6? It's 6:05. Great.
Yeah.
So I want to open it up for questions in a few minutes, but I still have a million questions myself. So I'm going to ask a couple more.
Great, thank you.
So you had this idea, and you and I have talked about, and you wrote at the end, I believe, about Stone Coast, or maybe
Yeah.
it was an article that you had. I know
Yeah.
you had a great experience. Can you tell people what that is here and how it helped you, and sort of
Yeah.
how it helped you shape the book?
Right, so Stone Coast is this tremendous, it's part of the University of Southern Maine, and it's a low residency MFA program. So you're hooked up with a mentor for 6 months at a time, and then twice a year you go for a 10-day intensive. And it was just phenomenal. I'd been writing poetry. I started writing poetry in my probably late 20s. And I wrote poetry probably about 30 years, and I brought out some books in my 40s and 50s. But then and they were a lot about being a mom and about living in Maine. And when I went to Stone Coast, my teacher said, you need to get to the tougher stuff. And one of my teachers gave me this great assignment: make a list of all the most mortifying moments in your life that you've never told anyone about, and then write about it. And I worked my way through the list. And
You did all of it.
I did all of them. And some of those are what ended, but what it was great is I went in writing poetry. I thought I was going to write, do an anthology of new poets. And then I ended up writing a memoir about child abuse and modern art and modern architecture and an abusive family. And when they said you need to go to the really tough stuff, I went to the tough stuff, and I had incredible support at Stone Coast. And I switched from poetry into prose, and then I had to learn how to write prose, since usually if you've been writing poetry, you write grocery lists and you write in journals, but I hadn't really written prose, and I had no idea how to write memoir. So I added another semester and just I had fantastic mentors and just kept working and working. And then my first book took me 10 years from the start. And then this one took me 5 years. I got going.
And the next one.
And the next one
will take you a year and a half. Are you already working on something else?
when I had gaps or when I had space, it's good to let drafts. So somewhere around the 8th or the 9th draft, I started working on the next memoir or the next story, which is I'm going to try learning to write a novel.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
When you were saying you had to learn how to write prose for a memoir, what were some of the things for any aspiring writers here that helped you? Were there books you read that you loved? Were there?
I loved Monica Wood. She wrote a memoir called When We Were the Kennedys about growing up in Mexico, Maine, and Meredith Hall's memoir about being 16 and being pregnant. And those two were just my guiding stars for memoirs. They were so internal, that internal awareness, and while describing things so vividly. And I would go through a chapter and go, how did she do this? And I would study it and go, because they move through time and they go back and forth. And also it's like when to do present tense, when to do past tense, because I had never thought about tense before.
Mhm.
In poetry, you so pare it down to the moment, but I would write a chapter in memoir and I'd write it all in past tense, and then I'd rewrite it all in present tense, and you would get a whole new layer out of it, another layer of vividness. And then sometimes I would take it back to past tense again. This whole book was in present tense. And I had an editor at about draft 9 or 10 said, it really needs to be in past tense, because you start doing all this sort of gymnastics to keep it into a continual present tense. So it went back to past tense, but keeping the vitality and the voiciness of teenagers. So it felt alive and in the moment, but it could have the perspective of the adult when you needed it. So there's so much to learn about really fine memoirs. Just do a lot of different layering of time and layering of voice that makes them really compelling.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things about writing memoir is that you are telling a story from your own past that is very personal, but of course it's controlled in that you're choosing what to tell.
Right.
I did an event with Meredith Hall recently, last month, and she has a novel called Beneficence.
Yeah.
It's very beautiful. The event was about that novel, or centered around that novel, but she got questions about her memoir that really caught her off guard.
Yeah.
Because it's a different kind of intimacy that people think they have with you when you write memoir. And when you write things that are so very deeply personal and sometimes shameful or, involve other people, it can feel very exposing.
Yes.
And Meredith was saying when she was promoting that memoir, she sort of was in the mode and almost had the armor to do it.
Yeah,
And now it caught her off guard to be asked about it when she's talking
she
about
didn't
a
have the
novel,
armor anymore,
which is a whole
right.
different thing. And so I just wondered what it feels like for you to be talking about your past and obviously with your other memoir as
Yeah.
well.
There's a way that part of writing poetry is that I learned how to be incredibly honest. Like I wrote a poem about being 11 or 12 at dancing school and being too embarrassed to go to the bathroom, and I peed in my pants. And that was one of those mortifying moments I'd never told anyone about. And it was like, I wrote it absolutely vividly. And it was like, once it was out of me, it was released from me, and I didn't carry it about as this embarrassing thing anymore. It was in a poem. So there's a way that writing it, or when I wrote Implosion, writing the really most intense stories, once I wrote them and they were in the book, in a way I get distance from them.
Yeah.
Or I got, in a way of protection. It's like the memories and the stories lived in the book, and I didn't have to keep carrying them anymore.
Yeah, oh, that's great.
Yeah, so
Yeah, I should try memoir. I'd love to hear one more.
Okay.
section.
I thought I would, do any of you know Pogo Stevens, who grew up on the island in Bar Harbor? Anyway, he was one of my
He's
other.
the only Bar Harbor person.
The only Bar Harbor
who was
person
on
on the ship, so I thought I would read about, I would read a Bar Harbor story. But before dinner, Pogo said, "Come see what I'm doing in the carpentry shop." I followed him down from the foredeck into a short, dark hallway to an open door. David, a blonde, muscular man, our ship's carpenter, worked at a massive bench, shaving curls of wood off foot square blocks to form a sharp point at one side. The crowded space was stacked with about 15 blocks. Pogo said, "We started these in Miami and are nearly done. What are they for?" Pogo glanced at David and shrugged. Pogo hesitated. "They're plugs in case a sea chest springs a leak in the hull." The sea chests were these huge metal grids that we've been scraping clear of barnacles as the ship's engines had a steady inflow of seawater. How could our ship leak? Isn't the metal hull thick? Well, the openings where the water comes into the ship are vulnerable, and the captain wants to be prepared for an emergency. David said, "I'll be down at dinner to finish up." Pogo drew a two-handed blade across the wood. "This is a spoke shave. I love wood curls." I picked up a handful. Pogo said, "The first time I was ever in a boat, there was a hole in the hull." What happened? He slowly pulled the tool. I was maybe 4 when my dad bought an old sailboat. His dad was one of the Jackson Lab scientists, Roy Stevens. I don't even think he really knew how to sail. One summer day, Pogo and his 2 older sisters and his parents crammed into the little boat and headed out into the bay off Bar Harbor. They had enough breeze to get out to the middle of the bay, and then the wind died down. Pogo glanced at me with a quirky smile. Suddenly about 4 inches of water rose in the boat. Mom panicked, but Dad said, "Oh, Gene, you worry too much." Pogo's eyes widened, and then a whoosh, and the boat filled to our knees, a puff of water, and we capsized. I gasped, imagining him at 4 out in cold water, far on the shore. "Could you swim?" "No, but fortunately my life jacket worked and I bobbed about, but I panicked. Luckily, his dad was a strong swimmer who pushed him up on the upside down boat. Wasn't too long before a lobster man arrived, brought the family aboard, wrapped them in blankets. He attached a line to the sloop, gunned the engine, and the sailboat slowly righted itself. I've been afraid of swimming in deep water ever since. I'm afraid of deep water, and I've never been on a sinking ship. I sat on a stool and watched Pogo work as he told the story. He and his dad went to the boatyard, discovered a leather patch had been nailed over a gaping hole in the hull of the boat. Even though I was only 4, I learned with my dad how to fix the hull and caulk the boat. He walked around the carpentry shop. We used hard hemp caulking strand. Here, smell it. He stuck a variety of objects and cans under my nose as he described the work they did on the sloop. Linseed oil putty, nautical paints. He grinned. When I was little, the smells were intoxicating. Whenever I sniff those smells now, I'm transported back. The whistle told us to dinner. So of course I had to have that scene because of course we have a leak.
Mhm.
And those blocks came in handy.
What is Pogo up to now?
Hugo is an architect for a British architectural firm and he works in China. One of the people on the call, Zip, who's in the book, he works in Costa Rica. Kim is a therapist with abused women in Dover, England. Jane, who was on our ship and was on the ship the next year, and she worked on ships and lives in Denmark. I sometimes think that a lot of us left, a lot of my teammates left the ship was because we were held captive and we were supposed to be protected by the American government in the Canal Zone, and we weren't. And I sometimes think that's why they became international.
Interesting.
And that there was a way that we became international on the ship.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like it changed all of you.
It changed all of us. Yeah, and all these kids, a lot of us became amazing. One of them became a billionaire who lives in the Channel Islands. One person worked for the NSA. And my brother went to sea and was a ship's captain, or no, a ship's engineer, and worked on huge cargo ships for most of his career. So I know a lot of these 70s kids who did a lot of wild things and then continued and figured out remarkable ways to work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, look, I have plenty more questions to ask, but I would like to open it up to the audience and see if anyone has questions for Elizabeth.
Yeah, can we go down to the basics? So you had only 3 months on the ship?
No, we were on it 6 months.
6 months.
So we got on board in October, November, December, we were working.
That
on
was
the ship.
supposed to be a junior year?
It was, I had already graduated from high school. I was a school librarian and a tutor. I was tutoring Mary
And you were only 17.
I was
You had already
17.
graduated from high school.
Yeah. So,
And she was the librarian, and it was one of the
Well,
real,
librarian is easy, to graduate from high school at 17, and then
it's true,
yeah,
it's true. And talk a little bit about putting together the
our
library.
library, they had been, lots of people donated books and I figured out a little, an abbreviated, system for, organizing the books and then I had to find a place on the ship to have shelves, and so we had about 5,000 books. And I invited my dad to come down and build shelves. And at first it was really great when he came down. He put the shelves, we had the library, and then he got slowly more and more controlling. And then he ended up disowning us before he left. When I was connecting with people from the ship, and they said, "Oh, your dad was so great. He was so interesting." It was like, yeah.
Wait till you read the book.
I tell you.
so you had to go just to because what I didn't get, maybe
Yeah.
everyone else, but it's like the organizational base. How many people crew were on the ship?
So,
Who was the captain? Who were you said you had some teachers with you?
we had, there were roughly 50 kids. There were 10 teachers.
And you were all the same age, like
The
17?
kids were 14 to 19.
And their parents had decided they could go.
They could go.
Yeah, and I had very similar youth, so I didn't find that so scandalous.
Yeah.
I grew up on an island where the situation was very similar, and
Yeah.
that's great, and we never went well hosted by anybody.
Right.
But still,
Well,
it's-
yeah, I mean, I would think
can't
many
be
of
wrong.
us who grew up in that, I
Yeah.
was a few years later, but my parents were absolutely like that. I mean, my father dumped my sister and me in cherry field in the middle to pick blueberries for 3 weeks, in the middle of like a labor revolt and no running water. And just, I remember him like laughing so hard he was crying as he drove away. We were like 16 or 15 years old. So it was definitely
Yeah.
a
Throw your kids in the
time
water.
period when, yeah.
There were 15 kids, 14 to 18. or
Yeah.
something like that. And
And then there
from
were 10
October to April or something?
Then we were, so there were then about 10 teachers, and then there weren't many crew members when we came on board, and they were still hiring crew, and some crew would come aboard and then they'd realize this is a losing ship and they would leave, and then they'd have to find more crew members. And we had this great, incredible Danish first mate who got us really going, he got us really working on
So
the
he
ship.
trained these.
So he
people
trained,
To get some, to be able to do something on a sailing ship.
On a sailing ship.
It had a steam, I suppose, in the motor.
It had huge engines. It had 6,000 horsepower. So they had to get the engine room going, and then we had to re-rig the whole ship because the rigging was rotten. So by the time we were by January 1st, the ship motored out of Miami and went over to Grand Bahama Islands to pick up the students who had been camping there for a week. And then we motored down to Key West while they were trying to figure out where we were going to go to dry dock, because we had a foot of barnacles on the bottom of the hull. So then we motored to Veracruz, Mexico, where we went into dry dock. The kids were sent off we're told to make groups of 3 to however many and go off exploring around Mexico for 2 10-day trips and come back in time. And then the ship was out of dry dock, finally ready to sail. We sailed out of Veracruz. We had 2 weeks to really learn to start our sail training, and we lashed on 16 of the 30 sails, and we sailed, and it was heavenly. And we were on our way through the Panama Canal to the
So you
Galapagos
came
Islands.
from the east into the canal.
Yeah, so we were coming in through Cristobal from the Gulf. And the owners of the ship, after the director had fundraised $400,000, which is $2.5 million now, that was put into the ship to replace the rigging, to have engineers working continuously on the ship.
So you had
So the owners decided they were gonna do whatever they could do to kick off the Mississippi school and get the ship back so that they could rent it. And so they had arrived ahead of us, and they had bribed officials, and they came aboard with soldiers and machine guns and to take back the ship. And they had a drug search on board, but they didn't find anything. But then 2 days later, the PT boats arrived again, and we were held hostage, and the director and assistant were put in jail.
So the owner was sailed under Panama flag?
The ship was sailing under the Panamanian flag.
That's where.
The owner was from Tennessee, and he had a ship's representative. And the two of them came down to Panama, and we were pulling, doing what was necessary to get us kicked off the ship. And then when the director was in jail, the American embassy wasn't answering calls from Americans in trouble, and the jail was full of Americans traveling through the canal. It was during the canal negotiations, and which ended up transferring until 78 when Carter passed on.
You really wanted to go through the canal? You wanted to?
We wanted to go, we had been given, because when the consul, the Panamanian consul in Miami came on board for a big event when we raised the Panamanian flag. And he had promised us free passage through the canal, both ways to go to the Galapagos. And we were in school, we were going to go study. Can you imagine if sailing to the Galapagos in the 70s?
It's a long way.
Yeah,
Really?
but we were held hostage for 2 weeks, and then we were told we were lucky to be released. And some of the parents raised the money to lease an airplane to sail us, to fly us out. And then our trustee, director of the school came up with another ship. She sent us to a farm in Puerto Rico for a month, and then she came up with another ship that nearly sank. It was
all by the seat of everyone's pants. There's a question back.
Yeah. I grew up in Glendale. It's called the Glass House. If you ask the Woody Garber house in Glendale, people can show you where it is. My dad designed the Cincinnati Public Library and different buildings he designed Sander Hall, which was the glass high-rise dorm that ended up being imploded. Yeah, he was a notorious architect. Yeah.
Whatever you just said, wait until you read the book, speaking of the other students, have any of the other students read the book?
For whoever wanted it, I sent them drafts of different parts. I would sometime on this Facebook page, I would post different chapters and I get their feedback. It's just how you remember it. I would run through and make sure it was accurate. So.
And Elizabeth, didn't people fact check for you some of the?
Yeah, we had, and then I have a young friend who works on square rigors now, and she went through and made sure all the nautical language was sort of current and correct. And then all my friends on the ship, and there were a lot of them on this call, went through it and gave me feedback and stories and said it wasn't quite like this. And it was really, really fun. The memoir of my childhood was a lot of really hard work to write. This was a hoot. This was so much fun to write.
There's a lot of joy on the
It's a
page.
lot of joy.
I mean, you're just feeling what it was like for you to come from such a restrictive
Yeah,
household where you felt the burden of work, and then there's this release and this joy of work. I
right.
mean, one of the things you described is what it feels like to have purpose,
Yeah,
even if you're working really hard. It's not
Yeah.
about the work, it's about the value that you have, that you yourself
yeah.
place
And
on.
we were splicing ropes for ratlines that were going to be going, that our lives depended on it. And most kids haven't ever done something that other people's lives depend on. And it really, really pulled us together as a team and also made us really responsible, and that we were relying on each other. And, you know, so the really wild, rotten kids who've been kicked out of schools and were avoiding doing everything, that we really had to come together and be there for each other. And that made it, as my brother said, every 14-year-old boy should be into a ship.
Well, I think that is the appeal of wilderness,
Right, and there's
outbound
so many sail training ships
Mhm.
now, and they have safety equipment now. So when you
Yeah.
go climbing up the city and you're 100 feet above the deck, you have a safety line where we had no safety line.
One poignant storyline is about the son of a celebrity, Mary Tyler Moore, her son who had a short tragic life. But he was 14, he was the youngest one,
Youngest kid on the ship.
and he was clearly neglected and also way in
Oh,
over where his head should have been. But you
I was-
really took care of him.
yeah, I was his tutor sometimes and would try to chase him down and try to get him to do something. And a lot of people really looked out for him, and I read him The Hobbit out loud. And he learned how to scuba dive. He was insisted on learning how to scuba dive. And one of the teachers, Carl, said, all right, no messing around. If you're gonna do it, you're gonna do it. And Richie worked with Carl down under, working on scraping off the barnacles on key parts under the ship for weeks. And it was probably the first time he'd ever worked hard on anything, and he was devoted to it. He really came around on that ship, on that journey. And then he went home and got into drugs.
Do we have one last question?
Do you sail after that? Do you sail now?
Not very often. I joke that I learned how to sail on a 360-foot ship, and I didn't really learn how to do smaller ships. And my brother, who went to sea, he would joke, people would say by the end of his career, how long have you been doing this? He said, oh, I started on a square rigor. Yeah.
Elizabeth, what are you working on now? One last.
Oh, my great grandparents died on the Lusitania, and my grandmother was orphaned at age 20. And her father, I learned when I read the incredible book Dead Weight about the
Eric Larson.
Eric Larson's incredible book about the Lusitania. He described my great grandfather as the most famous man in America in 1915 when the ship went down. So my grandmother was their love child. So I'm going to write about what it was like being a love child at the turn of the century and growing up in the American arts and crafts community. And then having to go down.
Oh, that's great. Can't wait.
Sorry.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much for coming. Yes, and thanks to the library, of course, the Garber Library, such a gorgeous building, and we're lucky to be
Here
here.
we are.
I know you're gonna sign books, which is great. I'm happy to sign if you want to pick up mine, and enjoy. You have such a fun reading experience.
That was so
Yeah.
much fun. Great question. Yeah.
What a great story. Where are we buying? Are you gonna sign?
I'll go back there. Yeah. It sat there in Panama for 7 years and everything we had done rotted away. But it was safe and it's now the sea file. It's now. It's the sea file. So it's now the grandest luxury sailing yacht in the world. Yeah, so my husband and I, we sailed on the sea file. Yeah, for research. So, no, but, one of our teachers on the ship decided to, we went to the lobby, we wanted to go over the thing. Yeah, yeah. You want to know what happened. Yeah. We should.